She had signed a contract expecting one husband. What she found when she stepped off that wagon was three men standing on the porch in the October dark, all of them tall, all of them silent, all of them watching her. The one who came forward first did not smile. He just looked at her directly and said, "Miss Whitfield, you made it." She would learn in the days that followed that none of the three knew which of them would marry her, and neither did she. This is the story of how Ren Isolde Whitfield came to Silver Creek Valley with one traveling case, a packet of seeds, and a future she could not read, and what she built there, one name at a time. 3 mountains, 1 heart. The church in Cincinnati smelled of candle wax and charity. Both were running low. Ren Isolde Whitfield sat in the second-to-last pew on a Thursday morning in late September of 1873. Her hands folded in her lap the way her father had taught her eyes fixed on the plain wooden cross above the altar. She was not praying. She was counting the cost of every decision that had brought her to this particular morning, this particular silence, this particular cold. Her father, Thomas Whitfield, had been a printer, a good one. His shop on Elm Street had turned out broadsheets and handbills and church programs and the occasional small book of poetry for 31 years, and in all that time he had never once asked a soul for anything he could not eventually repay. That stubbornness had served him well through lean seasons and slow years, and the grinding uncertainty of running a trade in a city that was always building itself into something grander than it had been the week before. It had not served him well against the tuberculosis that settled into his lungs the winter Ren turned 18 and took 2 years to finish the work it had started. The debts came after, medical bills first, then the back rent on the shop, then the mortgage on the little house on Maple Street where Ren had grown up counting letters in the type drawer and falling asleep to the rhythmic knock of the press. The bank was not unkind about it. They were simply thorough. By the time Thomas Whitfield was buried in the spring of 1873, the house was already spoken for. The shop equipment had been sold to settle the accounts. Ren was left with 3 dresses, her father's Bible, a packet of vegetable seeds that the neighbor woman pressed into her hands at the graveside, and the knowledge that she was 19 years old and owed no one anything in the world except the charity of her father's younger sister. Aunt Agnes Whitfield had a face like a fist and a heart to match. She was not cruel in the way that the word usually means. She fed Ren adequately and did not strike her and kept the guest room reasonably warm. But she had a particular gift for making clear through the angle of her shoulders or the precise duration of a silence exactly how much of a burden a grown niece represented in a household that had not planned for her. Every meal was a calculation. Every morning was a reminder. 3 months of that kind of hospitality was enough to understand that it was not strictly speaking hospitality at all. So when Agnes sat across from Ren one evening in late June with an envelope in her hand and a look on her face that was almost not quite apologetic, Ren already understood that the envelope contained something Agnes considered a solution. The question was only whether it was a solution to Ren's problem or to Agnes's. The envelope held a card for the Western Frontier Bride Agency run by a woman named Mrs. Hester Crane out of an office on 4th Street. Agnes had arranged an appointment. Agnes had in fact already spoken with Mrs. Crane at some length. Agnes had, Ren would learn later, received a finder's fee of $50 for the referral. None of this was explained that evening. What was explained in the way Agnes explained most things, which was to say, with the minimum of words and the maximum of implication, was that there was a man in Colorado Territory who needed a wife, that the arrangement would be handled through a reputable agency, and that Ren's passage would be paid. "You would have a home," Agnes said, "a real one." The word real sat between them for a moment, doing a great deal of work. Ren did not answer that night. She lay in the guest room and looked at the ceiling and thought about her father, who had never in his life signed anything without reading it twice. She thought about the packet of vegetable seeds on her windowsill, which she had not planted because she had not known if she would still be in this house when they might have grown into something. She thought about the word home and how she had not been able to locate one anywhere in the preceding 4 months, no matter how carefully she looked. In the morning, she went to see Mrs. Hester Crane. The office on 4th Street was tidy and deliberate, the kind of tidiness that is meant to communicate trustworthiness without quite achieving warmth. Mrs. Crane was a woman of 50, with the careful manner of someone who had explained the same things many times and had learned to do so with a neutral expression. She laid the contract on the desk between them. She explained the terms. She mentioned the name on the document, Caleb Hargrove of Silver Creek Valley, Colorado territory. One name. Wren read it 3 times to be certain. What Mrs. Crane did not explain, because she did not consider it her responsibility to explain what had not been asked, was that the letter attached to the contract had been signed by 3 different hands. She had composed the formal language herself, as she always did, and placed Caleb Hargrove's name as guarantor because he was the eldest and the one who had ultimately sent the agency's fee. The other 2 signatures she had deemed supplementary, a matter of family enthusiasm, not germane to the contract. Wren signed. She did not yet know about the other 2 signatures. She did not yet know that when the letter had arrived in Silver Creek Valley 6 weeks before, it had been opened at a kitchen table by 3 men who had each read it in turn, and none of whom had spoken for a full 3 minutes afterward. She did not yet know that the problem of which of the 3 Hargrove brothers might actually marry her had not, as of the morning she put her name to the page, been resolved in any meaningful way. She did not know any of that. She only knew that she had until the end of September to put her affairs in order, which took approximately 4 hours since her affairs had been reduced to what fit in one traveling case, and that on the 1st of October she would board the westbound train from Cincinnati Union Terminal with a ticket to Denver in her coat pocket in a future that was entirely illegible. Before the story goes any further, if you are new here, I want to say thank you for finding your way to this channel. I put out a new Frontier story every single week, and if this one is speaking to you, hit subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. And drop a comment below telling me where you are listening from tonight. I read every one of them, and it means more than you know. Now, back to Wren Whitfield and the train heading west. The journey took 4 days. The first 2 she spent pressed against the window of the second-class car, watching the flat Ohio farmland give way to the gentle roll of Indiana, and then the wide wind-combed prairies of Illinois. And she found that if she kept her eyes moving, she did not have to think too clearly about what she was riding toward. The 3rd day crossed into the vast open body of the continent, the sky growing larger overhead, until it seemed less like sky and more like an argument about the scale of things. The 4th day brought the first blue suggestion of mountains on the western horizon, and Wren sat up straight for the first time in the journey and felt something that was not quite relief and not quite dread, but lived somewhere in the precise geography between the 2. On the 2nd day, she met Mrs. Dorothy Finch, a widow of 55 who was traveling to Denver to visit her son and who had the particular gift of comfortable, undemanding company. She did not ask Wren too many questions. She offered shortbread from a tin and was satisfied when Wren ate it. When Wren finally told her on the afternoon of the 3rd day that she was traveling to be a mail-order bride in the mountains, Dorothy Finch did not flinch or offer false encouragement. She considered for a moment, looking out the window at the passing prairie. "I have known women," she said eventually, "who crossed an ocean for less reason than you have, and most of them built something worth the crossing." She did not say it would be easy. Wren noticed that and respected it. At Denver, she was met by a man named Silas Webb, who was 60 years old and built like something left out in all weather until it had achieved its final shape. He held a board with her name written on it in letters that had clearly been practiced. He was shorter than she expected and said less than she expected, and when he took her traveling case from her with a single efficient motion, she understood without being told that this was a man who expressed himself through what he did rather than what he said. They had 7 hours ahead of them by wagon, he explained, up into Silver Creek Valley. The last 2 hours would be on mountain roads. She should eat something before they left Denver, because there would not be another opportunity until they arrived. She ate. They left. The wagon road climbed steadily out of Denver and into the foothills, and then the foothills gave way to something grander and more serious. Real mountains, the kind that make a person understand that the world is not in fact arranged primarily for human convenience. The aspen trees on the lower slopes had turned completely gold in the October cold, and they trembled in the afternoon wind, so that the whole hillside seemed to be in motion. Higher up, the blue spruce held its dark color against the pale sky. The road narrowed, the air thinned. Wren breathed it in and felt it different in her lungs, cleaner and colder, and somehow more demanding, as if it expected something in return for being breathed. Silas drove with the settled competence of a man who had made this particular journey many times and had stopped finding it remarkable without quite managing to stop finding it beautiful. He answered her questions in the careful economy of someone who does not use language for anything beyond its functional purpose. "How long have you worked for the Hargroves?" Wren asked. 18 years, he said, "since before the middle boy was born." Wren looked at him. The middle boy. Silas glanced at her from the corner of his eye. Something in his expression suggested he was reassessing how much Mrs. Crane had communicated. "There are 3 of them," he said. "You knew that." It was not a question, but it landed like one. "The contract listed one name," Wren said carefully. Silas was quiet for a moment in the way of someone deciding how much truth is appropriate to the situation. "Cormac is the eldest," he said at last. "He is the one who sent the agency's fee. His name is on the paper. But Reed and Sawyer both wanted this too. All 3 of them agreed on it together. The agency woman, I expect, simplified things." Simplified. Wren turned the word over in her mind, examining it from several angles. "Which one," she said, "am I supposed to marry?" Silas looked at the road ahead of them for a long moment. The horses moved steadily upward. Below them, Silver Creek Valley was beginning to reveal itself through the pines, a wide open sweep of mountain meadow, a glint of water, the smoke of a chimney. "That," Silas said, "has not yet been decided." Wren sat with that information for the remaining 2 hours of the journey. She did not speak again, not because she was angry or frightened, though she was both of those things to varying degrees, but because she understood instinctively that silence was more productive than questions to which no one yet had answers. Her father had taught her that too. The press had mechanical problems, sometimes that could not be solved by agitation, only by patience and careful attention. She had learned to sit with a problem until the problem revealed its own shape. The problem, as she understood it now, had 3 shapes, and all 3 of them were standing on the porch of Hargrove Ranch when Silas guided the wagon through the gate and into the yard as the sun dropped behind the western ridgeline and the valley filled with the particular blue-gold light of a high mountain evening. She saw them before they saw her clearly. 3 men on a wide plank porch, all of them tall enough that they created a kind of wall of presence even at 20 yards distance. All of them still, all of them watching. Silas murmured not quite to her they'd been out there 2 hours. The wagon stopped. Silas climbed down and tied the horses with the practiced speed of long habit. Wren stayed where she was for a moment looking at the 3 men on the porch and took one slow breath of the cold mountain air, and then climbed down herself. The eldest came forward first. Cormac Hargrove was 34 years old and had the particular stillness of a man who had stopped needing to prove anything. He was broad through the shoulders and weathered in the particular way of men who work outdoors in high altitude, where the sun and wind take turns working on the skin. His jaw was square and set, and his eyes were the amber color of creek water over sandstone. He held his hat in both hands, which Wren would later understand was as much ceremony as Cormac Hargrove was capable of producing on short notice. He did not smile, but he looked at her directly, which she found unexpectedly more reassuring than a smile would have been. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "you made it." His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard without having to raise it. "I did," she said. Behind him, the second brother stepped forward to a position that was neither forward nor back, a kind of attentive middle ground. Reed Hargrove was 31, And where Cormac carried his presence forward like a thing he was offering, Reed carried his inward like a thing he was protecting. He was quieter in every dimension. He nodded once when Wren looked at him and said nothing, and his eyes, which were a darker amber than Cormac's, held something she could not immediately name. Not wariness. Something more considered than that. Something that was looking for information it did not yet have. The third brother came off the porch railing he had been leaning against with the energy of someone who had been waiting for a natural break in the silence. Sawyer Hargrove was 28, and he was the kind of person who existed at a slightly higher temperature than everyone around him. Where his brothers were still, he was in some minor constant motion. Where they were measured, he was immediate. The bread joke in the letter, he said, was it too much? Cormac said it was too much. Wren looked at him. Then she looked at Cormac, who had the expression of a man who had been enduring this particular younger brother for 28 years and had made a kind of peace with it. I thought it was honest, Wren said. Sawyer pointed at Cormac. Told you. This was in the precise sense of the word the first thing that had made Wren want to stay. Cormac showed her inside. The house had always had more rooms than 3 men needed, built of squared timber and riverstone, 2 stories with a wide staircase and rooms that had been constructed with an eye toward actual living rather than mere shelter. The front room had a stone fireplace big enough to stand in a braided rug in faded reds and blues furniture that had been built to last rather than to impress. The kitchen was through an arched doorway, and it smelled of wood smoke and coffee and something burned that someone had tried to cover with pine resin and almost succeeded. The curtains on the windows were plain but clean. Someone had made an effort. The house itself was in the complicated state of something that had once been cared for by a woman and was now cared for by 3 men who remembered what that had looked like without quite being able to replicate it. Cormac showed her to the room at the top of the stairs. It was the corner room, larger than the others, with 2 windows, one facing east toward the mountains and one facing south toward the valley. There was a 4-poster bed with a quilt in shades of deep blue and cream, a washstand with a clean basin, a chest of drawers, a braided rug, and a small iron stove already laid with wood, but not yet lit. And on the inside of the door, there was a lock. Cormac pointed to it the way a man points to something he has thought carefully about before pointing to. The key is yours, he said. No one will come to this door unless you ask them to. That is not a courtesy. That is a rule. Wren looked at the lock. Then she looked at Cormac. Who put the flowers on the windowsill? She asked. There was a small clay pot on the south windowsill with 3 dried stalks of wild columbine in it, the petals still holding their blue-violet color despite being long past their season. Cormac did not answer immediately. There was something in the pause that told her the answer mattered to him. Read, he said. He left without further explanation, pulling the door closed behind him, with the careful quietness of a man who has given the matter of doors a great deal of thought. Wren stood in the center of the room. The house settled around her in the particular language of old timber, the small creaks and sighs of wood that has learned to breathe with the seasons. Downstairs, she could hear not words exactly, but the rhythms of 3 men talking. One voice deliberate and low, one voice measured and sparse, one voice quicker and interrupted by the other 2, in the way that youngest brothers' voices always are. She crossed to the door and turned the key. The lock engaged with a clean, precise click. Then she sat on the edge of the bed, looked at her hands in the lamplight, and did not cry. She was not sure yet what she felt. She was sure that she felt it very precisely and that it would take time to sort out. She opened her traveling case and took out the blank journal we had bought at the station in Cincinnati and found her pen and wrote the date and then sat for a moment thinking about what to write. Finally, she wrote, the letter said one name. There are 3 of them. None of them knows who will marry me. I do not know either. The room has a lock and someone put dried flowers on the windowsill. I do not know yet what any of this means, but I think I will find out. She closed the journal and lay down on the bed in her traveling dress and looked at the ceiling until the lamp burned low and the house went quiet, And at some point, between wakefulness and something else, she heard a sound in the hallway that was soft and deliberate, and then stopped. And in the morning, she would find outside her door a cloth-wrapped parcel of biscuits that smelled faintly of pine smoke and had been left without any knock at all. Now, before we continue, and I promise you, we are just getting started, this is where things begin to get complicated in ways none of them saw coming. If you are enjoying the story so far, a like on this video helps more than you know. It tells the channel that stories like this are worth making. Now, morning came cold and gray. The biscuits were cold by the time she found them. She brought them inside, sat on the edge of the bed, and ate all three. They were plain and slightly uneven, the kind of biscuits made by someone who understood the chemistry of biscuits without having mastered the art. They were honest food. She was grateful for them in a way that has surprised her. She did not know yet who had left them. She would learn eventually that the question of who left the biscuits was a small and necessary argument that had taken place in the kitchen at 5 that morning between two of the three brothers, and that the third had resolved it by simply making biscuits and taking them upstairs before anyone could further complicate the matter. Downstairs voices. She sat very still and listened through the floorboards the way she had listened through the walls as a child when the adults in the house were discussing things they did not want her to hear. A man's voice measured and low. "Town's already talking." Then Cormac's voice flat as stone. "Town can talk." "I'm just saying what I heard." "Then stop hearing it." A pause. Then quieter Cormac again. "She is not a transaction, whatever anyone in town wants to call it." The sound of boots crossing a floor, the door opening and closing. Wren sat with that for a long time. Then she unlocked her door. She did not open it. She only unlocked it. She was not certain why, but it felt like a beginning of something that she could not yet name. She came down to the kitchen at 6:30. Reed was at the kitchen table with the coffee already made, which she would come to understand was simply where Reed was every morning at 6:30, as reliable as the sun's arrival over the eastern ridge. He had a ledger open on the table and a pencil in his large scarred hand, and he looked up when she came in. He did not say good morning in a way that asked anything of her. He just said it and went back to the ledger, which she found unexpectedly to be exactly what she needed. She poured herself coffee and sat down across from him and wrapped both hands around the cup. Her hands were still cold from the night. The kitchen was warm from the stove and smelled of pine and coffee and the faint ghost of the burned bread that seemed to be a permanent feature of the Hargrove kitchen atmosphere. They sat in silence for several minutes. It was not the silence of discomfort. It was the silence of two people who were each waiting to understand what kind of silence the other one preferred. "Why did you put the flowers in my room?" she asked. Reed set his pencil down. He looked at his hands for a moment, then at her. "You were coming to a place you had never seen," he said, "with people you had never met. I thought one thing that was familiar might help, something living." "Those flowers are not living," she said. "They are dried." "They were living when I found them," he said. "They are just finished now." She considered this. "How did you know what kind of flowers I would want?" "I did not," he said. "Columbine is the flower of this valley. I thought you should know the name of at least one thing when you got here." She looked at him, this quiet man, with his scarred hands and his careful words, and she thought that this was a surprisingly large thing to have done for a stranger. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and picked up his pencil. They drank their coffee in the particular silence of two people who were paying careful attention to each other without being willing quite yet to say so. This was how it began between them. Not with a declaration, not with a plan, with coffee in the morning, in the name of a flower, in the careful provisional territory of two people who are not yet sure what they are to each other, but are willing to find out. Cormac met with her that morning in the small office off the main room, a room full of ledgers and land maps and the accumulated paperwork of running a substantial ranch in a territory that was still working out the finer points of its own legal identity. He sat across the desk from her and laid the situation out with the same directness he applied to everything. There were three of them, one contract. He held the contract in his name because he had paid the agency's fee and because he was the eldest and because the agency woman had simplified things in the way that people simplify things when simplification is convenient. The arrangement they had intended, which was for Wren to come and become part of the Hargrove household in some capacity that would be determined once everyone had met, and the situation had been properly assessed, had not been fully communicated by Mrs. Crane. He was sorry for that. It was not fair to her. He told her she had 14 days by the contract's terms. He told her she was welcome to use every one of them. He told her that if at the end of those days, or before them, she decided this was not something she wanted to continue, with Silas would drive her back to Denver and they would pay her passage home, and there would be no argument and no debt. Then he told her the other part. The agency contract could be voided. He had learned through his own inquiries into the matter, because Wren's aunt had signed it on her behalf without legal standing to do so. Wren was not yet 21, and in some territories the signature of a legal guardian was required. Her father's estate had named a guardian, a lawyer in Philadelphia named Walter Finch, who had been her father's attorney and who had no idea any of this had happened until Cormac's letter had reached his office. Mr. Finch was in the process of responding. His response, whatever it contained, would determine whether the contract had any legal standing at all. This meant that Wren was here by consent, not by law, which Cormac said, looking at her with those steady amber eyes, was exactly the way he preferred it. I did not read the small print, Wren said. Few people do, he said. Did you? There was a pause that told her more than a yes would have. I read it after you signed, he said. She looked at him. There was something in this man that she recognized from her father, a specific quality of moral accounting, a habit of keeping a tally of what was owed and what had been paid that operated below the surface of everything he said and did. What do you actually want from this? She asked. Not from the contract, from this. Cormac set the contract aside and looked out the window at the mountains. My father built this ranch, he said. He worked himself to the edge of what a body can sustain to build it, and when he died 2 years ago, he left it to the three of us. It is a good ranch, the land is good, the cattle are healthy, the water rights are solid. He paused. But a ranch is not a home. A ranch is a working machine. We have been living in a machine for 2 years. My mother knew how to make it a home. We have forgotten. He looked back at her. That is what I want, and he said, honestly, someone who makes this a home again. I am not sure which one of us you marry. I am not sure that question is mine to answer alone. But that is what I want. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to Wren in several months. She spent the rest of that first week learning the shape of things. The ranch was 2,400 acres of mountain and meadow, one of the larger private holdings in Silver Creek Valley, running down from the timberline to the valley floor, where the creek itself ran cold and clear over smooth granite. There were 340 head of cattle in the lower pastures being moved progressively into sheltered ground as October deepened. There were 6 ranch hands who slept in the bunkhouse and worked from dawn to dark. There was Silas, who lived in a small cabin near the barn and occupied a position in the household that was something between employee and elder, a man who knew everything that had ever happened on this land and held his knowledge with the discretion of someone who understands that some stories are not his to tell. She learned the brothers through the rhythm of their days. Cormac rose before light and did not stop working until the light was gone. He was present everywhere on the ranch, in the way that the owner of a working property is present constantly, accounting, constantly deciding, carrying the weight of the whole thing in the set of his shoulders. He spoke to her carefully and directly as he spoke to everyone, and he answered her questions about the books with a thoroughness that told her he respected her ability to understand the answers. She found an error in the February ledger on her third day. $12 misrecorded in the cattle sale column, a simple transposition error, but one that had propagated through 3 months of subsequent entries. She marked it with a small red line and set the book on his desk. She did not mention it. He came to find her the next morning with the corrected entries and the January ledger, and a look that was in its Cormac way, an apology and a question and a thank you all at once. Check January, he said. She checked January. There was nothing to find, but the invitation was itself something. Reed moved through the ranch the way water moves through stone country, finding its own level without force. He was on the land more than the other two out in the early mornings, when the frost was still white on the grass and the elk grazed at the tree line, and he came in at dark, smelling of pine and Cold Creek water. He spoke when he had something to say and was otherwise quiet in a way that did not feel unfriendly, but rather complete, as if he had worked out that silence was generally more accurate than speech and had made his peace with that conclusion. He began in those first days to tell her the names of things, not as a lesson, not as a performance. He simply said them as they walked or worked or passed each other in the yard, and Wren, who had her father's gift for absorbing information, wrote them all down in her journal in the evenings. Aspen, blue spruce, Clark's nutcracker, the noisy gray bird that cached pine seeds all autumn, elkhorn sedge along the creek bank, the particular fold of the mountain ridge to the north that meant a certain kind of weather was coming in from the high country. She wrote them down and read them back before sleep, as if learning the vocabulary of a new place was the same thing as learning to belong to it. On the fifth morning, Sawyer appeared in the kitchen doorway while she was making biscuits and offered to show her around the north pasture on horseback. He said it the way Sawyer said most things, which was at some speed, and with the implied assumption that the answer was yes. The horse he brought out for her was a chestnut mare named Penny, who had the temperament of a seasoned school teacher, patient with honest effort, resistant to foolishness, and possessed of a very clear opinion about which direction she preferred to travel. Sawyer's instruction style was enthusiastic and only intermittently sequential, but he had an instinctive kindness about mistakes that made the learning easier than it might have been. When Penny declined to go east and instead turned firmly north toward the creek, Sawyer did not laugh at the situation. He laughed with it, and there was a difference. By the end of the hour, Wren had gotten Penny to agree on direction, if not always on speed, and when the mare nuzzled her shoulder as they walked back to the barn, Sawyer made a sound of genuine satisfaction. "She likes you," he said. "She is making a calculation," Wren said. Sawyer looked at her with an expression that was surprised and pleased in equal measure. "You're not wrong," he said. That evening, Sawyer came to find her in the garden behind the house where she had been examining the soil of a long, neglected bed that ran along the south wall and showed the faint structural ghost of what had once been a kitchen garden. He had 2 mugs of hot milk, one of which he handed her without asking, and he stood looking at the darkening valley for a moment before he spoke. What he said was not what she expected. He told her about their mother. Martha Hargrove had died 10 years ago when Cormac was 24 and Reed was 21 and Sawyer was 18. She had been, from the way Sawyer described her, the organizing principle of the ranch, not in a managerial sense, but in a human one, the person around whom the warmth of the place organized itself. She had kept a kitchen garden. She had known the names of every hand who had ever worked the land. She had argued with Cormac about everything and known when to stop arguing and been right by Sawyer's assessment roughly 70% of the time. When she died, something went out of the house that 3 men working very hard could not quite find again. Cormac carried it, Sawyer said. Carries it still. Everything that was hers he picked up. The responsibility of it. He just never picked up the permission to put it down. Wren held her mug and looked at the mountains going dark against the sky. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you deserve to know what you are walking into," he said, "and because Cormac never will." Then he said in a slightly different voice, the voice of someone who has made a decision to be honest, even though honesty in this particular instance is somewhat inconvenient. "Also because I think I may be falling a little in love with you already, and I have known you 5 days, so fair warning." He went inside before she could respond to this, which was, she would later understand, very deliberate on his part. She stood in the dark garden with her mug cooling in her hands and looked up at three windows lit on the second floor of the house, one for each of them, and thought about what Sawyer had said and what Reed had not said and what Cormac had said with such careful precision that every word had cost him something. Three men, one of whom she was by the remnants of a contract of dubious legality supposed to marry, and not one of them had made her feel like a transaction. That night, she went upstairs and looked at the lock on her door for a long time. Then she left it unlocked. She did not open the door. She only left it unlocked. She was not entirely sure why, but she thought that maybe it was the only language she currently had for what she was beginning to feel, which was something cautious and provisional and real, the first genuinely real thing she had felt since her father's hand had gone still in hers in the spring. She sat on the bed and opened her journal and wrote day 5. I am beginning to understand the shape of this place. I am beginning to understand the shape of these men. I do not know yet what I am to any of them or what any of them might be to me, but I think the question is worth staying to answer. For now, that is enough. Outside her window, the mountain air moved through the pines with a sound like breathing, and Silver Creek Valley settled into the particular hush of a high country night, and three men in 3 rooms did not sleep as easily as they might have on any other night before this one. It was, in the most cautious and provisional sense of the word, a beginning. The second week began the way the first had ended, quietly, and with the persistent sense that something was being decided by people who had not yet agreed on the terms of the decision. Wren had not spoken about the unlocked door. Neither had anyone else. But on the morning of the 8th day, when she came downstairs to find Reed already at the kitchen table with his coffee and his ledger, there was a second cup set out beside the pot before she arrived, still warm, as if the timing of her arrival had been anticipated. The cup was still warm. She curled both hands around it. She poured the coffee and sat down, and they had their morning silence, which had by now developed its own texture, distinct from the silences of the other rooms and the other men. Reed's silences were not absences. They were presences of a different kind, the way a river is present even when it is moving quietly. I want to look at the North Pasture accounts, she said after a while. Reed did not look up from his ledger. Cormac keeps those. I know. I have been through the main accounts twice. The North Pasture numbers do not reconcile with the cattle count from September. Now he looked up. His expression was not surprise exactly. It was the careful measuring attention of a man who does not rush conclusions the same way he checked a new animal in the herd before deciding what it needed. By how much, he said. 14 head on paper that I cannot account for in the physical tallies from October. Either the October tally was wrong or the September numbers were inflated. Reed set his pencil down and looked at her steadily. I will tell Cormac, he said. I was going to tell him myself. I know, he said, but he will hear it better coming at the end of the day after the hands have done the afternoon count. He is not at his best with problems before the sun has fully cleared the ridge. This was, she understood, a very specific and considered piece of information about his brother that Reed had offered her without being asked. She filed it away with the other specific and considered things he had offered her, all of them small, all of them precise, all of them adding up to something she had not yet found the right word for. She told Cormac about the cattle numbers at the end of the day, as Reed had suggested. Cormac listened without interrupting, asked 2 clarifying questions, and then sat with the information for a moment in the way he sat with most things, which was to give it the full weight of his attention before responding to it. I was aware of a discrepancy, he said. I had not yet identified the source. It goes back to August, she said. Whoever did the August tally marked 14 animals twice. Here. She had the ledger open to the page. She put it on the desk in front of him and pointed to the line. Cormac looked at it. Then he looked at her. That is Silas's handwriting, he said. I know. There was a pause. She understood that she had just identified an error made by a man who had worked this land for 18 years, a man whom the Hargrove brothers trusted completely, and that this required careful handling. Silas makes that particular error when he is doing the tally by himself in bad light, Cormac said finally. His right eye has been failing for 2 years. He will not admit it. He closed the ledger. I will speak with him, and I will have him work with one of the younger hands for the winter tallies. You might also have him seen by a doctor, Wren said. Cormac looked at her. He will refuse. I know, she said, but you should suggest it anyway. So that the suggestion has been made, and he has heard it, and it is on record between you. That is how you get a stubborn man to eventually do the thing he needs to do. You plant the idea, and you wait. Cormac was quiet for a moment. Then very quietly he said, How old did you say you were? 19, she said. He nodded as if this confirmed something he had been thinking. He did not say what it was. That was the nature of the second week. Things were being understood, but understanding and naming were different enterprises, and all of them, in their different ways, were moving toward naming with the caution of people who know that once something is named, it cannot be unnamed. On the 10th day, they went to Silver Creek. The town was a 20-minute ride down the valley road, a settlement of maybe 200 souls, organized around a single main street with the functional economy of a place that knows exactly what it is and makes no particular effort to be otherwise. There was Holt's General Store, which was also the post office and the informal clearinghouse for the valley's information. There was the Silver Creek Saloon, which was not a place Wren intended to visit. There was a small church under the care of Reverend Thomas Aldrich, who was a thin man with a white beard and the particular kind of benevolence that had survived long exposure to the wide range of human behavior that a frontier settlement produces. There was a livery, a blacksmith, a modest hotel for travelers passing through, and the modest frame building that served as the county assessor's office, and on alternating Tuesdays, the justice of the peace. Cormac drove. Sawyer and Reed stayed at the ranch for the fence work that had been deferred since the storm earlier in the week, a fact that Wren understood, without being told, was not entirely coincidental with the timing of the town trip. Cormac had arranged to go to Silver Creek with her alone. He had reasons for this that she suspected were partly practical and partly something else. Inside Holt's General Store, Mrs. Patricia Holt served them with the professionalism of someone who is gathering information at the same time as she is weighing flour. She was a handsome woman of 45 with quick eyes and the ability to hold two conversations simultaneously, one of which was the visible one, and one of which was the one she was actually having. Miss Whitfield, she said in the tone of someone who has been saying a name for some time before now, getting to use it directly. How lovely that you have come in. We have been hoping to meet you. The sugar, Cormac said, and the lamp oil. We have a list. Mrs. Holt smiled at him with the warmth of someone who has known a man since he was 12 and has earned the right to ignore his redirections. Of course, I will get those for you directly. She looked at Wren. I hope the valley is treating you well. It can be quite overwhelming at first, I know. So much wilderness, so much quiet. I find it agreeable, Wren said. Do you? Mrs. Holt's eyes moved between Wren and Cormac with a speed and accuracy that suggested she was compiling a report. And have you settled in comfortably? It must be a very particular situation. 3 men under one roof. She let that sentence find its own landing somewhere between observation and implication. The flour, Cormac said. 50 pounds. Wren looked at Mrs. Holt with the direct, untroubled gaze she had learned from watching her father deal with people who asked questions they did not have the standing to ask. It is a good house, Wren said. Well built. The men who live in it are decent and hard-working. The valley is beautiful. I am grateful to be here. She paused. The lamp oil, if you have the refined grade, please. The other kind smokes. Mrs. Holt blinked once, reassembled her expression, and went to get the lamp oil. Outside, a man was leaning against the hitching post with the elaborate casualness of someone who has arranged themselves to appear accidental. He was thick through the middle and red in the face from something that was probably not entirely the cold, and he had the particular confidence of a man who is accustomed to taking up more space than he has been strictly allocated. His name, she would learn, was Frank Decker, and he owned a modest spread on the eastern edge of the valley and a substantial grievance against the Hargrove family that predated anything she had been told about. "Well," he said in a voice designed to carry to the street, "the Hargrove bride in the flesh." He looked her over with the appreciation of someone examining livestock at a fair, not entirely hostile, but not within the boundaries of courtesy either. Which one of them is the lucky man's sweetheart, or is that still being negotiated? Wren stopped walking. Cormac, who was one step behind her, began to move forward. She put her hand on his arm. Not a restraint, a request. Then she turned to face Decker with the same untroubled directness she had used on Mrs. Holt, which was the particular look of a woman who has had to be precise about the difference between a question she owes an answer to and one she does not. "My name is Miss Whitfield," she said. "I don't believe we've been introduced." Decker blinked. He had expected either anger or embarrassment. He had not prepared for calm. "Frank Decker," he said after a moment. "Mr. Decker." She nodded pleasantly. "Good day to you." She walked to the wagon. After a moment, Cormac followed. He helped her up to the seat with the practiced economy of motion that characterized everything he did, and then he stood for a moment with his hand on the wagon board, not looking at Decker, but not quite looking away either. Then he climbed up and took the reins and guided the horses out of Silver Creek at a pace that communicated nothing in particular, which communicated a great deal. On the road back after the town had disappeared behind them, and the pines had closed in on either side, and the mountains had reasserted their indifference to human drama, Cormac said, "Decker has been trying to buy the north section of our land for 3 years, 600 acres that include the upper water rights to Silver Creek. He has offered 4 times. We have declined 4 times. And the discrepancy in the August tally," Wren said. Cormac looked at the road ahead. "I don't know yet. It may be nothing. Or it may be someone helping Decker understand the shape of your books." A long pause. "Yes." "Do you have reason to suspect Silas?" "No." The answer was immediate and unequivocal. "Silas has been with this family since before I was old enough to ride. That is not a question." "Then someone else had access to the tally sheets." They rode in silence for a while. The creek ran alongside the road clear and cold, and the aspens on the upper slope had lost most of their leaves now, the branches bare and silver against the pale October sky. "You are not what I expected," Cormac said. "What did you expect?" He thought about this honestly, which was his habit. "Someone younger," he said, "in the ways that matter." Wren looked at the mountains. "My father always said that running a print shop teaches you to see errors the way other people see furniture. After a while, you cannot look at a page without seeing what is wrong with it. And what do you see when you look at this?" She considered. "I see a ranch that is financially sound and physically well-maintained and run by 3 men who know what they are doing. I see a household that has forgotten how to be inhabited. I see a neighbor who wants what you have and is patient enough to wait for a mistake. And I see 3 men who are being very careful with me in ways that suggest they are less certain of themselves than they would prefer to appear." Cormac said nothing for long enough that she thought he might not respond at all. Then, "That is accurate. Before we go further into what was building between them, and something was building, anyone listening can feel it. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew something was important before you could say why? Where some part of you was further ahead than the thinking part? Leave a comment telling me about it. I want to know. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is a good moment to do it. There is more coming that you do not want to miss." On the 12th day, Silas came to find her in the kitchen garden. She had been working the abandoned beds along the south wall of the house for 3 days now, turning the compacted soil with a mattock she had found in the tool shed, clearing the old roots in the season's debris, preparing the ground for whatever she intended to plant. She had not yet decided what she intended to plant, but the work itself was satisfying in the way that all ground preparation is satisfying, the sense of making something ready for a future it does not yet know about. Silas stood at the edge of the garden bed and watched her work for a moment. He had his hat in his hands, which meant he had something to say that required the hat to be off. "There is something you ought to know," he said, "about how the agency found this ranch." She set the mattock down and looked at him. He told her about Decker. The story was not complicated, but it was not simple either. Frank Decker had not found the Western Frontier Bride Agency through any chain of coincidence. He had been directed to Mrs. Crane's office by a man named Garrett, who was an associate of Decker's who traveled between Denver and the eastern cities on various enterprises. Garrett had suggested to Mrs. Crane that the Hargrove brothers, three unmarried men with a large ranch and a social deficit, might be good clients for her services. He had framed it as a kindness. What it actually was, Silas believed, was a calculated disruption. Decker's reasoning, as best Silas could reconstruct it, was that introducing a mail-order bride into the Hargrove household would create sufficient internal complication, sufficient argument in jealousy and distraction, that the brothers would be less effective at managing the ranch. A managed decline over a season or two would produce the kind of financial pressure that might make them more willing to consider selling the north section. Decker had expected the disruption. He had not expected someone who checked the ledgers. "Why are you telling me this?" Wren asked. Silas turned his hat in his hands. "Because you are not what he expected," he said, "which means you are not what this situation was designed for, which means you might be exactly what is needed." He paused. "And because Cormac suspects some of it, but does not yet have the whole picture, and he needs it from someone he cannot dismiss." "He would not dismiss you," she said. "No," Silas said, "but he would soften it coming from me. He would assume I was protecting him from the full weight of it. He has been doing that since he was 24 years old, deciding what weight other people can carry." He looked at her steadily. "He will not do that with you. You have already shown him that." She thought about this for a moment. "You have been watching all of us." 18 years on this land," he said. "Watching is what I know how to do." She picked up the mattock, then she set it down again. "Silas," she said, "your right eye. Have you been to a doctor?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to deflect it. "Not recently," he said. "Cormac is going to suggest it," she said. "When he does, I hope you will consider it seriously." He looked at her for a moment with something she could not quite read. Then he put his hat back on, which meant the conversation was over. "You sound like Mrs. Hargrove," he said. He said it quietly without sentimentality, and he was gone before she could respond. She stood in the garden with the mattock and felt the weight of that sentence settle over her, like the first thin layer of snow that was going to come off the mountain very soon now. She did not know Martha Hargrove. She would never know her, but she was beginning to understand the shape of the absence she had left. That night was the first night the temperature dropped far enough below freezing that the pipes in the back wall of the kitchen needed attention, and all three brothers were up before midnight, dealing with it, moving with the practiced efficiency of men who have managed this particular problem before. Wren made coffee and stayed out of the way until she was useful, and then she was useful and they worked together in the lamplit kitchen until the problem was resolved and the pipes were wrapped and the cold had been addressed with the competence of people who understand that competence is how you survive winter in the mountains. Afterward, they sat at the kitchen table, all four of them with coffee and the remains of the evening, and Wren told them what Silas had told her about Decker. She told it the way her father had taught her to set type each element in its correct order. No embellishment, nothing omitted. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet except for the stove. Cormac's jaw was set in the way it's set when he was keeping something controlled. Reed was very still. Sawyer was looking at the table with an expression she had not seen on him before, which was the expression of someone who is being very careful not to say the first thing that comes to mind. "He used us," Sawyer said finally. He had not managed to keep the first thing from coming out entirely. "He tried to," Cormac said. "It did not work the way he intended," Wren said. A pause. Something moved through the room, not spoken, but passing between the four of them nonetheless. The particular current of people who have, in the course of managing a problem together, become something more than individuals in proximity. No, Cormac said. He was looking at her. It did not. Now here is where I need you to stay with me, because what happens next is the part that changes everything. And I mean that. The story takes a turn that none of them saw coming, and once it turns, it cannot turn back. On the 13th day, Frank Decker rode to Hargrove Ranch. He came in the middle of the afternoon, which was when the three brothers were farthest from the house. Cormac at the north fence line, Reed with the cattle at the lower pasture, Sawyer working the hay storage with two of the hands. Silas was in the tool shed. Wren was in the house alone, working at the kitchen table with the ledger spread around her, cross-referencing the cattle records with the land maps to try to establish a cleaner picture of the August numbers. She heard the horse in the yard and looked up. Through the kitchen window, she saw Decker dismount at the gate. He tied his horse with the ease of a man who expects to be here for a while. He looked at the house the way he had looked at the landscape from the hitching post in Silver Creek, with the calculating eye of someone who is already arranging ownership in his mind. He knocked. She went to the door and opened it. He was surprised to see her, not alarmed, just recalibrating. His expression reset into the easy, confident manner he had used in town. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "I was hoping to find Cormac." "He is not available," she said. "When do you expect him back?" "This evening." Decker nodded as if this were useful scheduling information. He looked past her into the house, not rudely, but with the possessive curiosity of someone who is assessing a property. "Beautiful place," he said. "Hargrove built it right. You have to give the man that. Built it to last." He looked back at her. "Hard country for a woman from the city, though, especially in winter. The cold up here is something different from what you are used to, and the isolation." He said the word with a particular weight, as if isolation were a condition she had not yet fully appreciated. "Nearest neighbor is 12 miles. Nearest town is an hour's ride in good weather. In a blizzard, this house might as well be the only place left on earth." "It sounds peaceful," Wren said. A beat. He had not expected that either. "Tell Cormac I came by," he said. "I have a revised offer on the table. Better than the last one. They should consider it." "Mr. Decker," she said. He paused. "I've been going through the ranch accounts since I arrived. The Hargrove operation is financially stable. The cattle contracts for next season are already placed. The land notes are current and scheduled to be retired 2 years ahead of the original term." She said this pleasantly and without inflection. "I am not sure what problem your offer is meant to solve." Decker looked at her. The easy confidence in his expression went through a small, careful renegotiation. "Business changes," he said. "Situations change. It is always useful to have options." "Of course," she said. "I will let Cormac know you came by. Good afternoon, Mr. Decker." She closed the door. She stood with her back against it for a moment, listening to his boots cross the porch and down the steps and across the yard, listening to his horse move away from the gate and down the valley road. Her heart was beating with more force than the situation probably warranted, but there was something clarifying about it, something that made her feel very specifically present in a way she had not felt since before her father got sick. She went back to the kitchen table and the ledgers. Her hands were steady. She picked up her pencil and found the line she had been working on and continued. She did not tell the brothers when they came in that evening. She waited until after supper, when the table had been cleared and the lamp was burning low and the house had settled into its evening quiet. Then she told them the same way she had told them about what Silas had said, in order, without embellishment, nothing omitted. This time the silence that followed was different. It was the silence of people absorbing something that has been confirmed rather than something that has been revealed. "You told him the accounts were sound," Cormac said. "Yes." He did not know that. He suspected it, but suspicion and confirmation are different things. She paused. "I thought it was more useful to let him know that the numbers were being read carefully, that whatever picture he had built of this operation was being checked." Sawyer was looking at her with an expression she had come to recognize over the preceding days, the expression he wore when something had moved him and he had not yet decided whether to say so. Reed said nothing. He was looking at his hands, which was not unusual, but there was something in the angle of his head that suggested the nothing he was saying was a very full nothing. Cormac looked at the lamp for a moment. Then he looked at her. "You sent him away," he said. "I answered the door," she said. "He chose to leave." Cormac considered this distinction. Then in the tone of a man who is saying something that has taken him some time to arrive at, "I should not have been at the north fence when he came. I should have anticipated the timing." "You cannot be everywhere," she said. "No," he said, "but I can be better prepared. We can." He looked at his brothers, then back at her. "We." The word landed in the room and occupied it fully. She went to bed that night with the locked door standing open 4 inches. Not because she had decided to open it, but because she had decided to stop closing it entirely. It was the 14th day when everything arrived at once. The morning brought a letter from Mr. Walter Finch in Philadelphia. He had, after considerable inquiry and correspondence, reached a conclusion regarding the legal status of the contract. His conclusion was this: the contract, having been signed by an unauthorized party, was legally unenforceable. Wren was under no obligation to remain. She was, in the precise language of the law, free. He had enclosed thoughtfully the return address of a women's boarding house in Denver that he considered reputable in case she required a transitional arrangement. Wren read this letter at the kitchen table alone before anyone else was up. She read it twice. Then she folded it and held it and looked out the window at the mountains, which were not at that particular moment offering any legal opinions. The second thing that arrived was Decker, but not in person. What arrived was a document delivered by a rider from Silver Creek addressed to Cormac Hargrove. It was a formal notice of a legal challenge to the water rights on the upper section of the property, filed with the county assessor's office 2 days before. The challenge was based on a survey discrepancy from 1871, a paperwork issue that had been known to exist but never resolved because it had seemed minor and the cost of resolution had seemed unnecessary. It was not minor now. Cormac read it at the kitchen table while Wren was still holding Mr. Finch's letter. He set it down and looked at it with the particular stillness of a man who is deciding exactly which of several things to address first. "This is a problem," he said. "Yes," she said. "It will require a lawyer and a surveyor and money that was not budgeted." "Yes." She paused. "The North Pasture revenue, if the cattle contracts go as projected, will cover a survey and preliminary legal fees. It will not cover extended litigation." He looked at her. "You have been running those numbers." "I have been running all the numbers," she said. "It is what I do." They looked at each other across the kitchen table. She set Mr. Finch's letter down in front of him. He read it. He read it again. He set it down carefully, the way he set down everything he was thinking about. "You are free to go," he said. "I can see that. There is no legal compulsion." "There is not." "Then I need to ask you," he said, in the voice he used when he was saying the truest version of something, "what you want to do." Wren looked at the letter, then at the legal challenge, then at the mountain through the window, its upper ridge catching the first light of the morning, going from blue-gray to pale gold, in the way she had watched it go every morning for 2 weeks. "I want to look at the 1871 survey records," she said. Cormac was quiet for a moment. "We have them in the office." "Then I want to start there," she said. "And I want to talk to Reed about what he remembers of where the survey stakes were placed. He would have been with your father." Cormac looked at her for a long time with those steady amber eyes, and she held the look without looking away because she had learned in 2 weeks that looking away from Cormac Hargrove was something he noticed and that he did not need her to perform anything she did not mean. "All right," he said. He got up and went to call his brothers. Wren poured a second cup of coffee and then a third and set them at the places where Reed and Sawyer would sit when they came down, and then she opened the ledger to the 1871 land notes and found the survey reference number and turned to the section where the water rights were documented. She was reading when they came in. None of them commented on the 3 cups of coffee waiting. They sat down and picked them up and leaned over the documents she had spread across the table, and the morning came fully through the window, and the stove heated the kitchen to a temperature that was for the first time in 2 weeks entirely comfortable, and they worked. She did not open Mr. Finch's letter again that day. She left it folded on the corner of the table, and no one asked her about it, and she did not offer it. The letter was still there when they broke for supper. It was still there after supper when she took herself upstairs. She stood in her room with the door open the 4 inches she had settled on and looked at the dried columbine on the windowsill, which was holding its color against all reasonable expectation, the blue-violet petals intact, though their season was long past. She took out her journal and wrote her last entry for that day, then closed it and went to the door and opened it fully. Not 4 inches. All the way. Then she went to bed. Down the hall in a room where a lamp burned low over an open ledger, Reed Hargrove looked up from the survey map he had been tracing from memory and sat very still for a moment listening to the silence of the house. He put his pencil down. He looked at the map for a long time. Then he reached out and very precisely closed the ledger and turned down the lamp and sat in the dark as the mountain dark outside his window and the house breathing around him. He was not certain of everything, but he was certain of more than he had been 2 weeks ago, and that was something he intended to think about very carefully before morning. Outside, the first snow of the season came off the high ridge and began its slow descent into Silver Creek Valley. Not a storm, not yet, but a beginning, the kind of snow that falls to let you know that winter has made its intentions known and the time for deferring to later has passed. It settled on the garden where Wren had turned the soil covering the dark earth in a thin, clean white. By morning it would be gone, but it had been there, and the earth underneath would remember it. Morning came with snow, still on the ground, and a decision waiting to be made. Wren dressed in the cold and stood at her east window for a long moment watching the light come over the ridge in the particular way she had learned to read over 2 weeks, the way the peak caught the first gold. Before the valley did, the way the shadows ran long and blue across the white meadow. The way Silver Creek itself was still dark while everything around it brightened. She had learned the names of things here. She had learned the rhythms. She had learned how to read the ridge for weather and how to read 3 men for something considerably more complicated than weather. She picked up the journal from the nightstand and opened it to the last page. 14 days of this valley. 14 days of these men reduced to one sentence that she had written in the dark, and that still held in the morning light. She knew where she wanted to be. She closed the journal. She went downstairs. All 3 of them were already in the kitchen, which was unusual. Cormac and Reed were at the table with the survey documents spread between them. Sawyer was at the stove, attempting something with the cast iron pan that smelled promising. The lamp was still on because the morning light had not yet fully cleared the ridge. The stove was well stoked. The kitchen was warm in the way it had taken here 2 weeks to understand was the particular warmth of a room that has people in it who intend to stay. None of them spoke when she came in, but all 3 of them looked up. She went to the stove, poured coffee, and turned around to face them. "I am not going," she said. The kitchen held that for a moment. Sawyer turned from the stove. Cormac set down his pencil. Reed looked at her with the steady attention he gave to things he was going to remember. "Mr. Finch's letter is legally correct," she said. "The contract is unenforceable. I have no obligation to be here by any external measure." She paused. "I am choosing to stay because the land survey problem is not solved, and the water rights challenge requires someone who can read the 1871 records and reconcile them with the current maps, and I have already started that work, and it would be inefficient to abandon it in the middle." She looked at the 3 of them. "Also because I want to." She had meant the second reason to be the more important one. She thought it had come across that way. She thought from the quality of the silence that followed that all 3 of them had understood exactly what she meant. Cormac said, "All right," 2 words, but they carried the full weight of Cormac Hargrove, which was considerable. Reed said nothing, but the set of his shoulders changed in a way that she had learned to read as the equivalent of a long sentence. Sawyer turned back to the stove and then turned back immediately. "She is staying," he said to no one in particular, in the tone of a man confirming something he had been hoping for long enough that the confirmation required an additional moment of processing. "We heard," Cormac said. "I know, I just—" Sawyer gestured with the spatula in a way that encompassed the kitchen, the mountains, the situation in general. "Good." Wren sat down at the table and pulled the survey documents toward her. "Before we go any further into the heart of this, and we are reaching the heart of it now, I want to take just a moment. If you have been listening to this story, if it has been keeping you company, in the shop or on the drive or in the evening, I am glad. Stories like this one are why I do this. Hit subscribe if you have not, and drop a comment telling me what part of the story has stayed with you the longest. I read every one. Now, there was still the matter of Frank Decker and the legal challenge to the water rights and what had been quietly growing between four people in a mountain house for 2 weeks. All of it was about to come forward at once. The survey records were a problem of the kind that is created not by dishonesty, but by the accumulation of small administrative failures over time. The 1871 survey had been done correctly, but recorded in a way that conflicted with the 1868 territorial plat, which itself had been drawn from an 1865 military survey that used a different baseline coordinate than the county had established in 1870. The discrepancy amounted to approximately 40 feet on the eastern edge of the upper water rights section, 40 feet that Decker's lawyer had identified with the precision of someone who had been looking for exactly this kind of thing for some time. Wren worked through it methodically over 3 days, cross-referencing the original survey stakes as Reed described them, and Reed's memory of where his father had walked the boundary with the original surveyor against the plat documents and the county records. She found what she was looking for on the second afternoon, a notation in the original 1871 field book, a small handwritten addendum that reconciled the baseline discrepancy and placed the Hargrove water rights exactly where the brothers had always understood them to be. The notation was in a different hand from the main survey text. It had been written by the junior surveyor, not the lead, and it had never been formally incorporated into the county record, because the junior surveyor had left the territory before the paperwork was finalized and no one had followed up. That notation, Wren said, setting the field book on the desk in front of Cormac, is the document you need. If it is authenticated by a licensed surveyor, Decker's legal challenge fails. Cormac looked at the notation. He looked at it for a long time. "How did you find this?" he said. "I read everything she said. My father taught me that errors are rarely the thing they appear to be. Usually they were the shadow of a correction that was made and not recorded. You look for the shadow and you find the original shape." Cormac set the field book down. He looked at her with those steady amber eyes, and then looked at the window, and then looked at the field book again. "I need to send this to Denver," he said, "to a surveyor who can authenticate it." "Silas knows the right man," Wren said. "He mentioned him when I asked about the county assessor's process. A man named Alderman in Denver who was originally trained in Philadelphia and knows both the Eastern and territorial surveying standards." Cormac looked at her. "You asked Silas about the county assessor's process," he said. 3 days ago," she said. "I thought it might be relevant." He was quiet in the way he was quiet when something had moved him, and he was deciding whether the situation warranted acknowledging it. "Wren," he said. It was the first time he had used her name without the formal prefix, and it landed differently from everything else that had been said in the room. "This ranch has been in this family for 22 years. My father built it from nothing. He worked it until it broke him, and when he died, he left it to us because he trusted us to hold it." He paused. "I have not been certain in the 2 years since he died that I was holding it well enough, that I was seeing clearly enough to see what I was missing." He stopped. He was not. She understood a man who spoke often about what he was not certain of. "You have been seeing clearly," he said, "more clearly than I have in some respects, and I am grateful for it." It was a long sentence for Cormac Hargrove. She understood the weight it had cost him. "Send the field book to Denver," she said. And then let me show you the projected accounts for next quarter because the numbers are better than you think. Something happened in his expression, then something small and genuine. Not quite a smile, but in the direction of one. All right, he said. Reed found her that evening at the creek. She had walked down to the bank in the late afternoon when the light was going golden and horizontal through the pines, and the water was catching it in pieces. She had her journal, and she was not writing in it, only holding it looking at the creek. She had come to understand that the creek was a place that helped her think something about the constancy of the sound and the movement that organized her thoughts without her having to organize them herself. She heard him before she saw him, the particular weight of his step on the frozen ground deliberate and unhurried. He came and stood beside her on the bank and looked at the water. For a while, neither of them spoke, which was entirely normal for Reed, and had become over 2 weeks entirely normal for her in his company. You found the notation in the survey field book, he said. Yes. Cormac told me. A pause. He also told me what he said to you. She looked at him. He was looking at the creek. He does not say things like that easily, Reed said. I know, she said. He has not said things like that to many people. Since our mother died. He paused again in the careful way of someone who is choosing the arrangement of words that will carry the most weight without more than the necessary amount. Cormac has been carrying this family for 10 years. He picked up everything she left, and he has not put any of it down. He does not know how to put things down. Sawyer said something similar, Wren said. Sawyer says it because it worries him, and he cannot hold worry quietly. Reed's voice was measured with no judgment in it. I say it because I think you should understand what you have done for him in 2 weeks without intending to. You have made him feel that someone else is paying attention, that he does not have to see everything alone. Wren looked at the creek. The water moved over the smooth granite, the way it had moved for 10,000 years before this conversation, and would move for 10,000 after it, indifferent to the weight of what was being said on its bank. Reed, she said, I want to ask you something directly. All right. Every time I read what I have written about you in my journal, I have written about seeing clearly. She turned to look at him. Not about what you have said, though I have written that too. About what it feels like to be in the same room with you. Like the air becomes more accurate somehow. He turned to look at her then. His eyes in the late light were very dark and very still, the color of the creek over deep water. I noticed that too, he said. What do you notice? He thought about it honestly the way he thought about everything. That you pay attention to things that other people do not see, he said. That you are quiet in the right moments and precise in the others. That when you walk into a room, the room becomes more itself. He paused. That when you are not in the room, I am aware of the difference. The creek moved. A Clark's nutcracker called from the spruce on the far bank, the same bird she had been watching for 2 weeks, hoarding its winter stores in the bark of the trees. Reed Hargrove, she said, I would like to stay as your wife, if you want that. He did not answer immediately. He looked at her in the specific way he looked at the mountain ridge when he was reading something important in it, with the full, unhurried weight of his attention. Then, I have wanted that since the morning I put flowers in your room. She had not expected the admission to reach so far back. She felt it in the center of her chest the way a bell feels its own ringing. You did not know me then, she said. No, he said, but I knew what it meant to put something growing in a room where someone was going to be afraid. And I wanted to do it. He paused. That told me something. They stood on the bank of Silver Creek in the fading light, and neither of them moved toward the other in any dramatic way because neither of them was that kind of person. But she reached out and put her hand in his, and his hand closed around hers with the particular firmness of a man who does not take hold of things he does not intend to keep. And they stood like that until the light was gone, and the cold came down off the ridge, and the creek went dark and silver in the early dark. She told Cormac that evening quietly before supper. He was in the office with the lamp on and the door open, which was how she had come to understand he was available to be interrupted. She stood in the doorway and said it simply. Reed. He had listened without looking up from the desk. Then he had nodded once, the slow nod he used when he was incorporating something that mattered. When he finally looked up, his expression was the one she had seen on him only a few times unguarded, just for a moment before the accounting resumed. Good, he said. The word carried more weight than it appeared to. She thought it probably carried the weight of 10 years. She left him to his lamp and his papers, and she understood that Cormac Hargrove's particular way of releasing something he had been holding was to say one short word and mean it completely. There was still the matter of Sawyer. She found him in the barn the next morning, which was where Sawyer often went when he was thinking about something he was not sure how to say. He was brushing Penny with the thoroughness of a man performing a task that does not require his full attention, which left the rest of his attention free to be quietly unhappy about something. He knew when she came in. He did not turn immediately. Reed, he said. Yes, she said. He kept brushing for a moment. Then he set the brush on the stall rail and turned around. She had expected something more complicated on his face. What she found was something that was white and genuine, and also underneath both of those things, something that was simply glad. He is the right one, Sawyer said. He has been the right one since the first morning. I knew it, and I thought maybe I was wrong, because I wanted to be wrong, but I was not wrong. Sawyer, I am not asking for anything to me, he said. I want to be clear about that. I am not saying it so that you will feel sorry for me or reconsider or do anything different than you have decided. He looked at her steadily. I am saying it because you deserve to know that what I felt was real and that it does not make me angry or resentful, and that Reed is my brother, and whatever is good for him is good for me, and I mean that. She crossed the barn and stood in front of him. You deserve someone who does not make you let go, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Yeah, he said quietly. Probably. Not probably, she said. Certainly. He was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression and returned to the Sawyer she had learned over 2 weeks, the warmth and the forward motion of him. You are going to let me teach you to rope cattle, he said. I was not aware that was required. It is absolutely required, he said. It is the only non-negotiable condition of my approval. Then I accept the condition, she said. He looked at her for a moment. It was something she could only describe as brotherly, which was, she thought, exactly what it was and exactly what it was going to be. Good, he said. He picked up the brush and turned back to Penny. Good. Now this is the part of the story that the town of Silver Creek was not expecting. And it is the part I want you to stay with because it matters in a way that goes beyond one story. It is about what it means to stand up for someone in public without being asked before you have to. Stay with me. 3 weeks after the morning Wren declared she was staying, Reverend Thomas Aldrich rode out to Hargrove Ranch with an invitation from the Silver Creek Ladies Social Committee. The committee, he explained with the diplomatic precision of a man who has been between difficult forces many times, had organized a welcoming reception for the newest resident of Silver Creek Valley. The following Sunday, at the church parlor, light refreshments. Cormac began to decline. Wren put her hand on the table. We will attend, she said. Aldrich looked between the two of them with the practiced neutrality of a minister who has learned not to take sides. Wonderful, he said. The ladies will be so pleased. When he was gone, Cormac looked at her. You do not have to do this. I know, she said. I want to. They will not be kind. I know that too. She looked at him steadily. I would like all 3 of you to come. He held her gaze for a moment. Something passed through his expression that she could not fully read. All right, he said. The church parlor on the following Sunday was decorated with the particular combination of gingham and false warmth that characterize formal social occasions in frontier towns, where the effort to appear civilized was directly proportional to the anxiety about not being. 12 women sat in the arranged chairs with their tea and their careful smiles. Mrs. Patricia Holt had positioned herself at the informal center of the arrangement, which was where she generally positioned herself. The three Hargrove brothers sat in a row against the far wall, Cormac straight-backed and neutral, Reed looking at the floor with focused attention as if the floorboards require study. Sawyer with his arms crossed, which on Sawyer indicated not hostility, but the effort of sustained restraint. Wren sat in the center of the room among the women with her tea. It began decorously enough. Weather, the season, the progress of the Aldrich family's fence repair. Then Mrs. Holt leaned forward. "Miss Whitfield," she said in the tone of someone who has been waiting for the appropriate pause. "We are all simply delighted you have joined our little valley. Though I confess we have all been wondering." She smiled. "The arrangement at the Hargrove place, it is quite unusual. 3 brothers and 1 young woman." She let the sentence continue its own momentum. "We have been hoping for some clarity on the situation." The room had gone very still. Wren set down her teacup. She sat with her back straight and her hands in her lap, and she looked at Mrs. Holt with the direct, untroubled gaze she had been developing since she was 14 years old, and setting type in her father's shop and understanding that a page either said what it meant or it did not. "Mrs. Holt," she said, "I came to Silver Creek Valley 3 weeks ago as a stranger. The men of Hargrove Ranch gave me a room with a lock on the door, and the complete freedom to leave at any time I chose. No one in this room offered me anything similar." Mrs. Holt's smile held its form, but lost its warmth. "We are simply concerned," she began. "You are curious," Wren said. "That is a different thing." She looked around the room at the gathered faces, some hostile, some merely interested, some actually uncertain. "I am going to marry Reed Hargrove. I am going to do so because I choose to, because I have spent 3 weeks watching these men work and live and treat me with more consistent decency than I have found in most other places. If any of you have concerns about the propriety of my situation, I would invite you to consider whether your concern is actually for my welfare or for the satisfaction of having an opinion about someone else's life." The room was completely silent. Wren picked up her teacup. At the back of the room, Sawyer uncrossed his arms. Then something unexpected happened. Eugenia Aldrich, the Reverend's wife, who was 71 years old and had been in Silver Creek Valley longer than anyone else in the room, stood up slowly from her chair. She stood the way old women stand, who have earned the right to stand at whatever pace they prefer, with the certainty of someone who has watched decades of smaller dramas resolve themselves and knows which ones matter. "She is right," Eugenia Aldrich said. She looked around the room at the women she had known for 30 years. "I remember when Earl Hargrove brought Martha to this valley. We were not kind to her either." She looked at Wren. "Welcome to Silver Creek, child. I hope you find what you came looking for." She sat back down. The silence shifted. It was still silence, but it was a different kind, the silence of people who have been shown something and are deciding whether to be changed by it. A woman near the window nodded. Another looked at her hands. Mrs. Holt rearranged the expression on her face with the visible effort of someone performing internal maintenance. Cormac stood up. The room turned to look at him. He had that effect. He walked to the center of the room and reached into his coat and took out a folded document. "With Reverend Aldrich's permission," he said. Aldrich, who had been standing in the doorway with the expression of someone watching a weather event that was significant but not, he hoped, fatal, nodded. Cormac unfolded the document and held it where it could be seen. "This is a registered land deed," he said, "filed with the county assessor 4 days ago. 200 acres on the eastern section of Hargrove Ranch, including the water access to the lower Silver Creek tributary, registered in the name of Wren Isolde Whitfield." He looked around the room. "Hers, not the ranch's, not my family's, hers. She may sell it, work it, or leave it, and walk away from this valley and from us at any time she chooses. Her presence on our land is not an obligation. It is a choice. It will remain a choice." He folded the document and looked directly at Mrs. Holt and then at the 3 or 4 other faces in the room that he considered most relevant to address. "If anyone has further questions about the arrangement at Hargrove Ranch," he said, "I am available." But I would ask that those questions be directed to me, not to her. He sat back down. The room absorbed this. Some faces showed genuine reconsideration. Some showed the particular expression of people who have been arguing from a position and have just had the position removed from beneath them. Sawyer against the wall looked like a man watching a very good piece of workmanship and appreciating it honestly. Reed was looking at Wren. When she looked back at him, he did not look away. She stood. I came here with one traveling case and a packet of seeds, she said. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. These men gave me more than they had to. They gave me time and honesty and the right to make my own decision. I am staying because I want to, because this valley is worth staying for, because the people I came to know in these weeks are worth the staying. She looked at Cormac and then at Sawyer and then at Reed. And because I choose them, freely, that is all any of us need to know. She sat down. There was a pause. Eugenia Aldrich began to applaud. It was not dramatic. It was the applause of a woman of 71 who has decided that the appropriate response to something genuine is to acknowledge it. After a moment, two other women joined. Then a third was a yawn. Mrs. Holt did not, but she also did not leave, which was perhaps the most that could be hoped for. Reverend Aldrich cleared his throat in the doorway. I believe, he said, that we might all do with a fresh pot of tea. The wedding was held 3 weeks later on a Saturday in early December in the Silver Creek Church under a sky that had come in pale and clear and cold as the inside of a well. The congregation was modest Silas in the front pew, with his hat in his hands, and his expression of a man who considers things like weddings to be private affairs that he attends out of loyalty rather than ceremony. The Aldriches, several of the ranch hands in varying degrees of formal clothing, Mrs. Holt in the back row, which was as much of an acknowledgement as she was prepared to make, and Eugenia Aldrich, who had brought dried wildflowers and placed them at the end of every pew without asking anyone's permission. Cormac stood beside Reed, which was its own kind of statement. Sawyer stood on Reed's other side, which was the natural order of things, and also the only arrangement that made sense. He had combed his hair for the occasion, which Wren noted and found for reasons she could not entirely articulate very moving. Reverend Aldrich began the ceremony. When he reached the words of the vow, when he asked Reed Thomas Hargrove if he took this woman, Reed looked at Wren and said quietly and without preamble, I will. Not I do, not the expected words in the expected order. I will. Wren understood immediately. He was not describing a state. He was making a promise about a direction, about what came next, about every morning after this one. She looked at him, this quiet man with his scarred hands and his careful words and his dried flowers on a windowsill, and said, I will too. Aldrich paused for only a moment, reassessed, and continued. Cormac, standing 3 feet to Reed's left, looked at the floor in the way of a man who has something in his expression that he is not prepared to share with a church full of people. But his shoulders, for the first time since Wren had known him, were not carrying anything extra. Just his own weight, nothing more. Outside the church window, Silver Creek Valley lay white and still under the December sky, and the mountains stood in their permanent witness, and somewhere above the timberline, a hawk turned in a thermal that nobody on the ground could feel. Now I want to take you forward, not far, not in years yet, but in season, because the story does not end with the ceremony. The ceremony is only the name for a decision that had already been made. Spring came to Silver Creek Valley in the particular way that mountain spring comes not all at once, but in arguments, cold nights, and warm afternoons, the snow retreating up the slope in increments, while the creek ran high with melt, and the aspens put out their first pale leaves like a question asked carefully before the answer is committed to. Wren's garden, the beds along the south wall that she had turned and amended and prepared in October, was waiting under the last of the snow. She had planted before the ground froze bulbs she had ordered from a seed catalog in Denver tulips, and crocus and a variety of columbine that bloomed earlier than the wild kind. She had planted them, knowing they would not appear until spring, She had planted them anyway. They came up in March a little later than the catalog had promised, but they came. Cormac found her in the garden on the first morning that she noticed the crocus standing in the mud, in her working boots, looking down at three purple points pushing through the snow-bare soil. He stood beside her and looked at them. "You planted these in October," he said. "Yes." "You did not know if you would be here to see them." She looked at him. "I was making a bet." He nodded slowly the way he nodded when he was incorporating new information into his assessment of a person or a situation. "The Alderman survey came back from Denver," he said. "Decker's legal challenge has been formally dismissed. The water rights are confirmed." "I know," she said. "Silas told me yesterday." "Silas told you before he told me." "He found me in the garden," she said. "You were at the north fence." Cormac considered this. Then, Decker sent a letter. Cormac read it at the kitchen table and set it down without comment. Wren read it after him. It was 3 sentences long. The standing offer on the north section was withdrawn, permanently effective immediately. No explanation was offered. None was needed. A man who had been waiting for a weakness and had found instead a woman who read ledgers and a surveyor's notation from 1871 did not need to explain why he was walking away. He simply walked. Cormac put the letter in the desk drawer where he kept documents that were resolved, and that was the last they heard of Frank Decker. Silas mentioned a week later that Garrett had moved on to Cheyenne the previous month on other enterprises. The valley had grown quieter for his absence. She looked at the crocus. "Good," she said. The letter from Mr. Walter Finch, still folded in the drawer of her writing desk, had long since ceased to represent a question. But she kept it there anyway because she had learned from her father that the documents of a life, even the ones that had been superseded, were worth keeping. They told you something about where you had been. They told you something about how far you had come from there. The apple trees she planted in April were Sawyer's idea, which he had arrived at through a process of reasoning he explained to her over 3 mornings while she was working the garden. Apple trees, he said, took years to produce fruit, but they also lasted for generations. A tree you planted, knowing you would not see the first harvest, was a particular kind of statement about your intentions. Intentions about what, she said, about staying, he said, about the future, about believing there is a future worth planting for. She looked at him. "That is remarkably thoughtful for this early in the morning." "I have my moments," he said. She planted 4 trees along the eastern fence line of her section of the property. Sawyer dug the holes because the ground was still partly frozen and required more force than she wanted to apply at 7 in the morning. Reed mixed the soil amendment in a bucket, which he had prepared the previous evening, and brought out without being asked, because that was how Reed expressed most things. Cormac watched from the fence rail for a while, and then picked up a shovel and started on the 4th hole, which was the most frozen of the lot, and said nothing about it. The 4 of them worked in the morning light until the trees were in the roots settled, the earth tamped down. Then they stood it and looked at 4 sticks in the ground that did not yet resemble trees in any meaningful sense. "They will not be worth anything for years," Cormac said. "I know," Wren said. "Good thing you are not going anywhere," Sawyer said. She looked at the 4 of them, her husband and his brothers, and the hired man who had become something that the word hired did not quite cover anymore, all of them standing in the April mud of a mountain morning, looking at 4 sticks in the ground like they were looking at something that mattered. They were. The summer brought the cattle work and the fence repairs in the long days that mountain summers produce, when the light lasts until 9 and the meadows go green and the elk move up to the high country and the creek drops to its summer level and runs clear over the white granite. It was good work. It was the kind of work that builds something when it is done alongside people you trust, and she trusted them. She had learned to trust them the way you learn the vocabulary of a new language, one word at a time, and then in sentences, and then one day you find yourself thinking in it. Reed taught her to read the weather and the peaks the way his father had taught him. She taught him the accounting notation system her father had used, which was faster than what the ranch had been using and produced cleaner records. They worked at the kitchen table in the evenings with the ledgers between them, and the quality of the silence had changed from the first mornings to something that was simply the sound of two people who have made their peace with the same space and find it comfortable. Cormac rode to Denver in August. He did not explain the purpose of the trip before he left. He said only that there was business at the land office and that he would be back in 4 days. He was back in 3. When he came back, he was quieter than usual, which was quiet indeed, and he had a letter in his coat pocket that he did not mention and that Wren did not ask about. But she saw him a week later, writing a reply to it at his desk in the evening. She passed the office door, and he was there with the lamp and the paper and the particular expression of a man who is composing something carefully word by word, the way you compose things when the words matter. She went on to the kitchen and made tea and brought a cup to the office door. She set it on the corner of the desk without comment. He looked up. His expression was not the expression she expected. "Thank you," he said. "Of course," she said. When she passed the office again later, the letter had been sealed and addressed, and the address was a woman's name at a boarding house in Denver, a name she did not recognize, and she said nothing to anyone, and waited because she had learned by now that Cormac Hargrove moved toward things in his own time and could not be hurried without cost. Sawyer, who noticed things even when he pretended not to mention to her one September morning that Cormac had been to Denver twice more since August. "He has not said anything," Wren said. "He will not," Sawyer said, "until he is sure. He never says anything until he is sure." "Does that frustrate you?" Sawyer considered. "It used to," he said. "Now I think it is just how he is built. Some men figure things out loud. Cormac figures things out alone and then tells you when he is finished." She looked at him. "You are more generous about him than you used to be." Sawyer shrugged. "He is a good man. He is hard on himself in ways that make it look like he is hard on everyone else. Once you figure that out, you stop taking it personally." He said this as if it were a simple observation, but she understood that it had taken him 28 years in a particular kind of love that does not require approval to get there. That winter, the first real storm of the season hit Silver Creek Valley in November. 3 days of hard wind and heavy snow that kept everyone on the property and tested the preparedness of everything that had been prepared in the autumn. The livestock were in the sheltered lower pastures. The feed stores were sufficient. The pipes had been wrapped and the wood was stacked, and the pantry was stocked with the precision of people who had been told by the mountains that preparedness was not a courtesy, but a requirement. They weathered it together, the 4 of them, plus Silas and the ranch hands working in shifts through the worst of it, and on the 3rd evening, when the wind had dropped and the snow had stopped, and the valley lay white and still under a sky that had gone brilliantly clear in the way that comes after storms, when the air has been scrubbed clean, they sat at the kitchen table and ate supper and said very little and were entirely comfortable in the saying of very little. This was home, not the house, not the land. This. The second winter brought changes. Cormac brought Margaret Shaw to Silver Creek Valley in February of 1875. He introduced her without drama or ceremony in the way he did most things, by simply arriving at the ranch with her beside him in the wagon and bringing her in for coffee. She was 32, a quiet woman from Denver, who had the particular steadiness of someone who has had difficult years and come through them with her judgment intact. She had dark eyes and a way of looking at things that was assessing without being unkind. She and Wren sat across the kitchen table from each other for 20 minutes while the men were in the barn, and arrived without discussing it at a complete understanding of the situation and each other's position in it. It was the most efficient conversation Wren had had in years. "He is not easy to know," Margaret said. "No," Wren said, "but he is worth it." "I know," Margaret said. "I have been watching for 8 months." Wren looked at her. "He has been writing to you since August." "Since June," Margaret said. "The August letter was when he proposed." Cormac and Margaret were married in the Silver Creek Church in April, a quiet ceremony attended by the same small congregation that had witnessed the first one, with Eugenia Aldrich, again in attendance with her dried wildflowers, which she had apparently adopted as a personal mission. Now there were two Hargrove households under one ranch roof, which was larger than it had been before, and which Wren had come to understand had always been built with this in mind. The house had always had more rooms than three men needed. It had been built by a man who intended it to be full eventually, and it was beginning to be. Sawyer's courtship came in the spring. He had been corresponding in the careful and somewhat overworked prose of a man who does not trust himself to be interesting on paper, with a woman named Odette Bennett, a school teacher who had come to Silver Creek that autumn and taught in the small schoolhouse at the end of Main Street. She had auburn hair and green eyes in the particular confidence of a woman who has managed 30 children in an underfunded classroom and emerged with her patience intact. Sawyer had been conducting the courtship with the combination of enthusiasm and miscalculation that characterized most of his enterprises, and Wren had been advising him on the letters with the editorial detachment of someone who has useful skills and is willing to apply them charitably. The letter that came in April was not from Odette, it was to Odette. Sawyer put it on the kitchen table in front of Wren. "Read it," he said. She read it. It was the best thing he had written yet, which was to say it was honest and imprecise in the specific way of a man who does not know how to be dishonest, but has not yet mastered precision, and the honesty of it was enough. "Send it," she said. "Are you sure, Sawyer?" she said. "Send the letter." He sent the letter. Odette Bennett became Odette Hargrove before the following winter in the same church with Eugenia Aldrich's wildflowers on the pews again, and Silas in the front row again, and the four of them standing together as they had learned to stand present, steadied, claiming their place. The apple trees in the October of 1877 put on fruit for the first time. The early frost had not yet reached the lower portion of the property where the eastern fence ran, and the trees had produced a modest display, small and a little uneven, the first attempt of something new that had spent years quietly becoming equal to its own purpose. Wren stood among them on a morning when the light was doing what it does in Colorado October, going gold and long and horizontal, and making everything it touches appear important. Reed came and stood beside her. "Not much," she said, looking at the fruit. "First year," he said. "I know." She reached up and touched one of the apples, red, green, and small, firm under her fingers. "My father used to say that the first anything is never the best. It is only the proof that the thing is possible." Reed looked at the trees. He had the look he sometimes got when he was thinking about something that went back further than the present moment, back through years and seasons to the places where things had their origin. "He would have liked it here," he said. "Your father." She looked at him. Yes, he would have. He would have wanted to know the names of every man. He would have driven you to distraction with questions. "I would not have minded," Reed said. She believed him. She knew him well enough by now to believe him completely when he said things like that. He meant every word he said and no more, which was she had come to understand one of the rarest things in the world. Silas came around the corner of the barn at his usual unhurried pace, slower now than he had been, but steady. He had been to the doctor in Denver the previous spring at Cormac's suggestion, which he had finally agreed to, on the grounds that being argued with by three Hargrove brothers and one Hargrove wife was more exhausting than the appointment itself. The doctor had given him spectacles, wire-rimmed and slightly crooked, on his face in a way that he had stopped being self-conscious about. He looked at the trees. He looked at Reed and Wren. "Good year for them," he said, about the trees or possibly about everything. "First year," Reed said. "First of many," Silas said. He stood for a moment longer, this man who had seen everything and held all of it with the discretion of someone who understands that some stories are not his to tell and some are. Then he went on. She watched him go and thought 18 years on this land, and he had never once told any of them what he thought the future held. He simply kept showing up for it. From the direction of the house came the sound of voices, multiple and overlapping in the particular way of a house that has become full. Margaret's voice from the kitchen, and Cormac's answering from somewhere above, and Sawyer from the direction of the barn calling to someone Wren could not see, and the higher voice of a child, Cormac and Margaret's daughter Eleanor, who was not yet 2 and had recently discovered that volume was an option. The house that had been built for a family was a family, not the family it had been designed for, not the one Earl Hargrove had imagined in the specific way that men imagine the future of what they build, but a family nonetheless built in the way that things are built when they are built, honestly. One decision at a time, one winter at a time, one name at a time. Reed reached out and took her hand. His hand was the same as it had always been, large and scarred and calloused and warm, the hand of a man who works the land he intends to keep. She held it. The columbine came up again this year, she said. It does, he said, every year. I planted those in October, she said, the first year, before I knew anything. You knew enough, he said. She looked at the mountains, the ridge she had learned to read for weather, the peak that Reed's father had named the Widow's Shoulder, the one that looked like someone who had learned to stand again after losing half of themselves. She looked at it and thought, as she sometimes did, about the October morning she had climbed down from a wagon in a strange yard and looked up at 3 men on a porch and understood that she did not know what was happening, but that it was in some way she could not yet articulate important. She had not known any of their names then. She had not known the name of a single thing in this valley. She knew them all now. From the house, the child's voice again rising into the clear October air, and Cormac's deeper voice responding, and the sound of a door and boots on a porch, and the specific carrying laugh of Sawyer Hargrove, which had not changed in 4 years and was not likely to. The mountains held their silence, which was not silence at all when you knew how to listen to it, but a sound with many layers, wind and water, and the movement of animals through timber, and the particular frequency of a high place that has stood through everything and will stand through everything still. Wren stood in her orchard in the October light and held her husband's hand and listened. She had come here with one traveling case and a packet of seeds, and a name she did not yet understand was only the first of many she would learn. She had put things in the ground that took years to matter. She had learned the names of every mountain and every creek and every bird and every person who mattered in this valley. She had read the books and found the errors and stood in the church and said what needed to be said and chosen at every point where a choice had been available to her to stay. The apple trees stood in the morning light, small and imperfect and real, their first fruit hanging red-green and earnest in the October air. They were only beginning. And in the house behind her, lamplight spilled through the kitchen window, and someone was starting the stove for the morning, and the smoke rose straight up in the cold, still air above Hargrove Ranch in Silver Creek Valley, held its breath for a moment in the way of beautiful places that know what they are and do not need to say so. The door opened. The warmth came out to meet the cold. And Wren Whitfield Hargrove, who had come here with nothing she could keep and stayed to build everything worth having, turned from the mountains and walked toward the light.